Welcome to this Care Experience History Month event. I'd like first to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of ancestral lands on which I live. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country and respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Care Experience History Month 2022 builds on the first ever Care Experience History Month last year. It was the initiative of Who Cares Scotland, a Scottish organisation working with care experienced young people and care leavers across Scotland. Who Cares Scotland invited activists and allies from around the world to commemorate the history of care experienced people in their country. And people across the globe came together to understand and learn the history of the care experience community. By care experience, we mean people whose childhoods have been disrupted or interrupted by being orphaned, by being abandoned by parents, by being removed from parents by the state. In Australia, we often think of care experienced people in different terms such as stolen generations, former child migrants, forgotten Australians, care leavers, people who've been in out-of-home care, GOM kids. My name is Dee Michelle and I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide. I'm also a former foster child. At the age of 3, I was arrested, charged with being neglected, committed to a children's home, and then delivered to a foster home where I stayed for 15 years. 2 women of hundreds who've been influential in me gaining some understanding of the impact of childhood experiences have been Judith Herman, an American psychiatrist who did pioneering work on trauma and recovery from it, and Alice Miller, a Polish-Swiss psychologist who focused particularly on child abuse. Miller's single message was that children who are abused in childhood will repress their feelings, suffer in silence and deny the abuse or rationalise they deserved it. Repression is a gift in childhood, Miller says, as it's rarely safe for children to express their emotions and challenge adults about the way they are treated, nor will they necessarily have the words. But if denial continues into adulthood, the repressed emotional knowledge has 2 effects. One is that adults might develop psychosomatic illnesses. The other is that people will do as adults what was done to them as children, physically assaulting their own children, for example. Such repetitions of the past are automatic, unconscious, until they're brought to awareness and understood as deriving from childhood events. Miller has 3 concepts I think have an ongoing usefulness in addition to that main one of facing past pain. First, she has the idea of poisonous pedagogy, recognising that parents are influenced by socio-cultural ideas of child raising, and it refers to the kind of parenting that wounds children, often to exert full control over them. Some proponents of control have advocated breaking the child's will so completely that the child will be controlled by a look. Second, the idea of a helping witness, someone in a child's life who is there to support the child, not the parent. Someone who identifies with the child, demonstrates gentleness, empathy, and kindness. A helping witness doesn't make excuses for the parent, but stands in solidarity with the child, seeing and acknowledging the impact of the parent's behaviour on the child. And third, an enlightened witness, a person in an adult's life who listens to the adult recount their childhood experiences and encourages them to feel those long repressed emotions and come to a sense of themselves as victims of their personal history. Tonight, we're going to have a conversation with a person I regard as an enlightened witness, a man who has listened to thousands of adults over the past 30 years and encouraged them to feel long repressed emotions. Welcome, Tony Tonkin.
Thank you.
And full disclosure, Tony Tonkin has been my partner for the past 31 years. Tony Tonkin is an accredited mental health social worker who has been working in private practice since 2015. Tony became interested in counselling when he was a volunteer counsellor for Lifeline, where he worked for 6 years. While at Lifeline, Tony was a founding member of the Confronting Violence and Abuse group, which provided a team of group facilitators to work with men who had been violent and abusive. After that, Tony worked for a range of organisations, including Anglicare in their break-even gambling rehabilitation program, the Vietnam Veterans Association, where he provided counselling and ran programs for Vietnam vets and their families, For Relationships Australia, where he ran a whole host of programs, including what to do about anger and how to handle anxiety and stress, as well as for several EAP or employee assistance programs. Tony has a strong commitment to social justice, which means that much of his private practice focuses on working with the most disempowered people in the community. He founded the Child Protection Party in 2015, a political party born partly out of frustration at the way government social workers blame parents rather than seek to understand and help them. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Dee, and thank you, Frank, for being here as well. Good to see you. So this is recorded and will be played back later, I'm assuming. So for those people that do watch this video later, you will have an opportunity to leave comments behind, and when we see those comments, we'd be happy to respond to them if need be. I just wanted to start by perhaps talking a little bit about what trauma is and how it particularly impacts people. As Dee has stated, I've been working in the area of trauma, I guess, since I first started practice over 30 years ago. And it comes in all shapes and forms. And it's not like it sits on a continuum in a way. Trauma is simply an experience that somebody has had that is they're finding overwhelming and that disrupts that particular person's ability to cope, to function in the world in which they're living. When it is repeated and extreme, and that occurs over a long period of time, or is perpetrated in childhood by caregivers, it is called complex trauma. I personally don't like the word complex because that often infers that it is something that's very difficult to deal with, and therefore it tends to present as a challenge and as something which perhaps for the therapist, for those people working with a client, a lot of work has to be done. And so it tends to have a negative connotation, I think. The same thing applies when people refer to issues as being extremely complex, or there are complexities there, because it often says that sometimes that I have the solution to this problem, whereas you may not because of the complexity that it sits around the issue. A few other things about trauma that I think we need to remember is that 2/3 of people who present to mental health services, that's inpatient and outpatient, have a lived experience of child physical and sexual abuse. Now, 2/3 is quite a number in terms of the number of people that would be impacted. It is estimated that there's about 5 million people who suffer from some form of trauma in Australia. So the number of people that experience trauma in some form or another, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, is extreme. The services that are available to those people, regretfully, probably are not adequate enough to deal with the people or to work with those people who are suffering from some form of past or recent trauma. Trauma-informed practice is a set of words, I guess, that we're using currently to describe for those of us that work in the area what sort of practice is required in order to meet those people that are traumatized. And it's a strength-based framework. Now, that strength-based framework fits very nicely with social work because we did not learn about trauma and trauma-informed practice when I was doing social work. I don't know whether they do so today, but we did learn about strength-based practice and strength-based approaches. But there are 5 core principles that underlie how we work with trauma. They are safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment, as well as respect for diversity. Now, trauma-informed practice, like hopefully all practices, should do no harm. And I guess by that, we're meaning that they don't re-traumatize people by having that conversation about their trauma. For years, when I was starting out in practice, it was suggested that you shouldn't discuss or talk about someone's trauma unless they gave you permission to do so. Well, there's some truth in that we shouldn't go down places that we think are going to be damaging to clients. But particularly when a client arrives at your doorstep and they want to talk about child abuse, for example, then clearly that is a subject which needs to be explored. If they're talking about other issues that sit in their lives, which we suspect are related to their childhood, then clearly we need to go down that path also and explore what it is from their childhood that's impacting the present. This is just the way I guess most therapists would work, but I think we're moving a little bit further away now from accepting the old notion that for some reason we should not explore trauma with people. So, and the question really here is then, what is trauma? What does it mean to have a traumatic experience in your life? And trauma can be a number of things. I've got a couple of examples just to express that, I guess. So the trauma can be if a child grew up without being hugged or being told that they were loved. For that particular child, that could be traumatic when they're older because they don't have that sense as to what love looks like, what it appropriately feels like, and how therefore to express love to others. I say this because I know from my own personal experience, I didn't get that. And I know that produced results in relationships in the first instance, when I first started to go out with women, that was pretty much unhelpful. And as an adult, though, I was able to address those issues and make sure that my behaviour was not I was not emulating my father's behaviour, I guess. But I was at least able to recognise that simply that was, to some extent for me, traumatic, not to have that sense of love in my life, to have a father who I couldn't work out was proud of me or not because he never told me. So the question for me, what did that mean? Fortunately, and thank God for going off and doing social work and for meeting my current partner, I was able to work through those particular issues. So I guess we could argue that that's one set of trauma. At the other end of the spectrum, there are a whole host of, if we call it a spectrum, but there are other hosts of sorts of traumas as well. And the degree to which they impact one is not determined. It's about looking at trauma in terms of where is the person right now? How has that trauma impacted their lives? And how are they functioning or coping as a result of the trauma that they've experienced? So at another end of the spectrum, we could have a trauma which was around continual child abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional and psychological abuse when that child was young, and how that had manifested itself throughout their life. We could say, in my experience, that there was something I was doing that was causing me to be unloved by my parents. That in itself could have been quite traumatic. For a person who has been sexually abused, physically and so forth, when they're young, they get a completely different message about their value, a more impactful message, if you like, about who they are and how they should interact with the world. But it doesn't differ necessarily all that much from my version of how I was felt when I was growing up and whether everything was my fault because no one expressed their love to me. I hope that kind of makes sense, that just because someone is sexually abused, which is horrific in itself, or physically abused or live in a violent household, is in a sense not all that different from the feeling I might have had growing up. So what it does mean then is that we need to explore with people exactly how, whatever the experience is, not label it as complex trauma, extreme trauma, or whatever, but how that event, no matter what it may have been, how that necessarily has impacted that individual, how they're processing that now, how that impacts their lives, their relationships with others, and what they can do to address it. And one of the most important things I think about therapy that we need to consider in relation to any form of therapy, and particularly trauma, is the relationship we choose to build with, or the relationship the client chooses to build with the therapist. What does that look like? How is it that that therapist is able to manifestly affect that relationship in a way that enables the person to be able to have really difficult conversations in a way which the client is not feeling judged, having their experiences minimized in any way, and believe that they're being heard and understood. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have to have had the same experiences in order to work with that person. It does mean, though, that you need to have skills which are about listening appropriately, responding when needed, and being able to ask appropriate questions that helps the client to better understand what's happening for them. In my practice, one of the things that I focus on primarily is around where a person is at emotionally. How is it? How would they express their emotions today? What language would they use to describe the feelings that they have that are impacting their lives? I've developed a technique, in fact, which explores a range of emotions, not just the 2 or 3 that most people tend to want to use to describe how they're feelings, but actual feelings that people can relate to once they discover the language that they use. And I've done this many, many times. I've been able to ask people to explore a list of words that describe emotions, and they come across certain words that resonate with them, words they wouldn't normally use. They'd often say, for example, I feel hurt, or I feel frustrated, or I feel angry. But they may not use the word, for example, I feel betrayed. And sometimes that word, that singular word, can trigger an emotional response in them that surprises everybody, particularly them. And following from that, there can be an array of feelings that are expressed, usually tears, sobbing, that in that moment, often the client will find them in that traumatized event and what that means to them, and be able to, for the first time often, to articulate the meaning behind the experience that they've had, which they haven't been able to express all of their lifetime. So I've got more I can say, but if there are any questions.
Perhaps a comment, Tony, thank you so much for that, and Dee for your introduction, which was very useful and enlightening. I take what you say about the complexity of understanding the severity of an event, mm-hmm. and then somehow or other making an assessment of the impact of the event.
Yep.
And it seems to me that, I know you don't like the word complex, but it seems to me extraordinarily complex to figure out the relationship between the severity of an event and the severity of the impact of the event. I have in mind of course, the National Redress Scheme, where people are asked to describe the event that's traumatized them, and then to themselves assess or give an understanding, express an understanding of the impact of the event. And I just scratch my head and think, how can anyone do that? Every situation is unique. Just take the question of child rape. It seems to me that if a child is raped at the age of 15, compared to another child who's raped at the age of 5, you can't talk about rape as a concept without understanding the really significant differences in the context. In this case, age.
You raise a fabulous point, mate. That's often been raised as well with me. And what I've come to realise is that when a child, and psychologists will tell us this as well, that when a child is extremely young, it isn't that they don't have feelings. They do. The problem with it, of course, is they don't have language to match the feelings. So the expression of what happened to them when they're young is impossible. So when they're older, though, and they get that list that I provide for them, they can often find the words now for the first time to describe this experience way back then. And that's where the emotion comes in. So the emotions are present with them all the time. Yeah. And then suddenly they find, like a ray of light, that they can start talking about those feelings that never ever been able to articulate because they didn't think they could, to suddenly finding a way that they can. And the remarkable thing about that, Frank, is that sometimes it takes just one word to be able to bring out the emotion that's been sitting in someone their entire life. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I immediately think of the National Redress Scheme, where there's a list of words which the application form provides for people. And I no doubt it's well intentioned, but it seems to me the wrong list.
You're probably right.
You know, I don't think, what was the example you gave when you were talking about your words? I can't remember the exact word, but it struck me as being a good one. because it opened up.
It was betrayal.
Betrayal was the word I
yes.
used.
Yeah, that's a fantastic word, because I think so many people, and particularly young people in care, would have felt betrayed because they were taken from parents because they were in danger and then supposed to be safe, but they were betrayed. That seems to be a much better word than some of the words on the list, which is so generalized, like mental health.
Oh my God.
People are supposed to say that it's had an impact on mental health. Well, you know, circling that word or the cluster of words doesn't tell anyone anything.
No, it's nondescript.
Yeah. Yes.
I think the other word that's often important to people, I think, is shame.
Oh, yes.
So sometimes, you know, as a therapist, you understand what words and language best fit. You don't always get it right. And so reflecting back a word that may fit with the story you're being told is often integral in terms of the healing process for a client. So in other words, instead of going through that list that I've got, you can choose a word that you think relates to that incident, and a person will respond by saying, yes, that's it. That's just it, you know, and then they start to express that in ways which, and they start to talk about it. So it opens up a whole host of other stuff, because when a person identifies the word, their experience back when they were much younger, and the word that they used to describe whatever was happening to them back then is in some instance still present today. And shame is a good example of that. So there might be very things that they feel ashamed of themselves, ashamed of their behaviour, ashamed that they can't get the right job, or that they're unemployed, or they're on benefits, or that they're disabled, or in a bad relationship. So there's lots of things that they feel ashamed of. And the degree to which that shame has intensity is not always about the event that's happening to them now. It's about an accumulation of shame, if you like, from the day one, the first time they felt shame, and how that has accumulated like an onion layer over years, and it just got more and more intense. So the experience that they're having now around shame, which is expressed in choosing bad relationships, drug and alcohol use, mental well-being issues, bad relationships generally, unemployment and other things, all gets unpacked in that one incident. So once we understand where that comes from in the beginning, we can spend a lot more time significantly unpacking all those other issues that may sit around that feeling that are happening to them today. And I find that, and clients generally find that, quite a helpful process.
No, I was just going to say, it's a very powerful emotion, isn't it, shame?
Yeah, it's one of the most powerful emotions there is.
Yeah, and when people work through it and understand that it actually wasn't their fault, something happened to them that they should not be ashamed of, because they had no responsibility for it. I wonder if they paradoxically then become ashamed that they carried on in that way for years, believing something which was false.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we find in the child protection space in particular is that one of the risk factors for parents who have their kids removed is those parents who themselves were in care. Yeah. And, you know, shame sits around a lot of that as well, because firstly, they're ashamed that they were the ones responsible. As young kids, they often feel responsible, that they must have done something wrong to be removed from their parents, even though I guess many of them do know that their parents had issues that caused the department to take them away. But they feel ashamed about the situations they found themselves in, whether it was a crappy foster care, many foster care situations, residential care, and so on. So shame itself takes on this whole new perspective if you're a foster kid, or if you're in the care of the state. And eventually, you know, these poor parents then have their own kids, and another layer of shame, guilt, embarrassment, whatever you might like to call it, is added to that when they find that their own child is taken. You know, and with many of these parents, this is the first opportunity they have ever had to be loved unconditionally. And that moment of having that child taken from them, to having that unconditional love removed from them, is extremely traumatic, as one can imagine, because it's just on top of all the other layers.
Tony, can I go back to, I wanted to go back, I've been sitting here struggling, I've been listening, but also been back where you were ages ago, talking about your own experiences of trauma, and then thinking about some of the, what we might socially seem as more extreme forms of trauma, and you used rape, for example. So are you saying that the important thing there is how the person experiences that? And I guess it's different from legal terms as well, because a lawyer was telling me the other day, it's very different for a child to be groomed rather than rape, but that was coming from a legal perspective, and then maybe redress and compensation and et cetera, et cetera. But if you're coming from an emotional therapeutic perspective, then how do you explain that?
I'm not too sure if I understand your question, Dee.
Well, I was thinking that in some ways that illustration that you gave of your experience might be seen as minimizing what we would see as more extreme cases of child abuse, for example, rape.
Yeah, I was saying that we need to be careful that we don't put degrees on it, that we don't say that a person's experience, for example, a person who has experienced one foster care placement, which was kind of okay, as opposed to someone who experienced a foster care placement that was, well, many foster care placements or abusive foster care placements or whatever, is any different. It is about, I think, who that individual is, how they choose to process that, what support mechanisms they have around them throughout that journey, in fact, and the way that they come out the end. I think, I had an interview with, I don't know if I mentioned the person's name, but I had an interview, it's up on our Facebook page, with Amy Gill, who had an experience which, for a lot of the people that she experienced that same type of environment with, had totally different outcomes to Amy. So the question we need to be asking ourselves, I think, is, okay, how did that person come about? Who was that person? Why were they able to have a different type of outcome, given they went through the same experiences as a whole lot of others? So I'm not saying that it was less traumatic. I'm just saying that person, so the person who had a terrible outcome in terms of the way they now conduct their lives, going through the same experience as someone like Amy did, does that mean then that their trauma was different from the trauma of someone else who went through the same experience but seems to have managed it differently? No, I don't think it does. So I guess what I'm saying is, in terms of my own case, I could have chosen to have experienced something that could have taken me down a path that was completely different than the one that I chose, right? Now, if that path was a terrible path and bad relationships and all those other drug use and whatever followed, then I could argue that experience I had, which some would minimise, was just as traumatic to me as somebody else who experienced another. Does that kind of make sense? I'm trying to explain it the best way that I can, and I don't know whether I'm successful.
I guess your understanding of trauma is very different from what I see from not that I have a legal perspective, but when I've thought about it or seen it from redress applications, where it seems like they're trying to not look at outcomes, but measure how much trauma somebody went through by rating whether being groomed.
I see, yeah.
Whether being groped is worse than being raped. So that's coming from a legal perspective. What I'm saying is you seem to be coming from quite a different.
Well, it's from an emotional perspective.
It's
about how those.
Okay.
It's about how we survey those emotions, how we question around them, and as I've talked about before, the processes I use to do that, and then the outcomes. Because when I meet people, those outcomes or the way they're behaving or the impact of their trauma is often quite extreme, hence the reason why they're seeking help. I think that there's an avenue here while dealing with trauma, particularly kids in care, is to find different ways to deal with it. That firstly, we need to acknowledge that the experience that a person has even is potentially traumatic. So in the child protection space, kids being removed from their parents, regardless of their parents' behaviour, is traumatic. To send a young child, to a new school with a set of people that they don't know in itself is traumatic. So one of the things we need to be aware of, I guess, is particularly in terms of kids in state care, is we need to make sure that we're not creating environments which is adding to additional traumas they may already have had from living with their parents. And we're lousy at that. I don't hear social workers, the people that I know that work in the field, talking about mitigating against trauma. I just don't. I don't hear that trauma being acknowledged, apart from the trauma that they believe the child has experienced while in the care of their biological parents. It's almost like it's a concept which only relates to the parents and where this child has come from, not from the system itself, which adds a different layer of trauma on top of the other trauma anyway. So I think there's a couple of things I want to mention about working around trauma, though, if I may. So when I was working with the Vietnam Vets, it's Vietnam Vets Counselling Service, as it was back then. Anyway, when I was working for them, I developed a couple of systems that was about discovering what trauma was. Now, this was nearly 20 years ago now, so most of the men were in their 60s back then, I guess. All of them had experienced some form of trauma. And the question that was often raised of me, if you're going to talk about trauma with Vietnam vets, you've got to be, so this is where this idea came from, we can't talk about trauma because it will re-traumatize them. And we can't re-traumatize them because I don't know whether people thought their arms and legs would fall off, they'd all have heart attacks. I don't know how they thought they'd respond. But it was the process was you couldn't re-traumatize. And then I said, bugger that, I'm going to develop something that I thought was really helpful. So I had this process which was, I experimented with it. So just as a bit of a sideline for anybody, any therapist who does watch this, is I think therapy is an experimental process. I think that there are sometimes we don't know what it is that's going to happen, but then the client doesn't know we're experimenting either. And we experiment every time we ask a question that was new to us, that we've never asked before. We don't know how the client's going to respond to that or the process. So everything I think we do is, and therapy is about creativity. So you need to be creative in the process to get the best result that you can, I think. So in one of these groups, I was thinking about how can I best find out, how can I get to an emotional level that is significant and reveals stuff to people. So the lifestyle program that I was running for the vets ran for 6 days. So I decided on the third day, I was going to try something that was different. I had this theory in mind, but I didn't know how it was going to work. And so what I did was they were with their partners, most of them. So there would have been 20 people in this group. So we're in a large circle, all sitting, the male, the female, and so on. And I said to them, I've got 2 questions to ask you. All right. The first question is, I just want you to just say the first thing that comes to mind. So remembering this purpose of this exercise was to find a way to get to them at an emotional level so we could have a conversation about their emotions, which we couldn't do with these men because they were so closed. And for me, it was impacting their relationships with their partner, their kids, everybody. And the idea of this program was to try and get some stuff out. And we were struggling. So I thought of this idea. Anyway, I said, the first question that I'm going to ask you, and I want you just to think about the first thing that comes to mind and then talk about it. And the first question was, this is what I do, I'd say, what is your greatest fear? And then I'd be quiet. And then I'd say, after a few minutes, a few seconds actually, while I thought about that, I said, we'll go around the group. And so we went, around the group, and people would say, oh, my greatest fear is, heights, or my greatest fear is losing my partner, or my greatest fear is, losing one of my kids. So they'd go around, they'd talk about their greatest fear. And then I'd say, I'm going to ask you another question. This time, I'm not going to go around the group. I'm just going to sit and wait for you to tell me what your answer is. And I'd say, I want you to think about the saddest thing that's ever happened to you in your life. And we'd sit and we'd sit. And then someone would say something. And I remember one particular guy who said, I've never talked about this before. The family was out on a family holiday, and we were attempting to cross a creek. And the creek was deeper than I thought. And the car got swept away with my wife, the 3 kids, and me in it. And we were trying to get out of this torrent. And the kids and the wife were getting out, and I had a baby who was only a few months old. And I had the baby in my arm, and the water was rushing so strongly that I couldn't hold on to him anymore. And I had to let him go. And that man, and he broke out into tears, like uncontrollable sobbing, and his wife did as well. He said, I've never spoken to anybody about that before. And that was kind of a pivotal moment for him, to be able to talk about that trauma that sat in his life. It had nothing to do with being a Vietnam vet, I hasten to add. But it was impactful because it had a lot to do with him and his family and how he behaved around them, because he never wanted to let go of his kids. Interestingly enough, when I was reflecting on this earlier today and his situation, from that moment on, they adopted kids. They had what we called the United Nations group of kids. They were kids from all over the world. And my guess would be, because if you have your own kids, you might lose them. So it's easier, safer for them, I guess, emotionally, to adopt them. So that was one of the stories. I just wanted to recite another one, if I may. There was and this was in the same group, funnily enough, I think, but this happened in lots of groups that we did. So I was doing the same thing. We went around, what's your greatest fear? What's your saddest thing? And this guy, I'm going to cry when I talk about this, because I still get emotional when I think about it. He said, I can't talk about it. I just can't talk about it. And he got up and he left. And I went out, and there's this pergola at Hundorf where we were, and we stood under the pergola. And I was co-working, so I had another worker who took over the group. And we went out under the pergola, and he told me this story, which I will never forget. So this is about, I think, I'm telling you this because this is about types of trauma. Guy that lost his kid, nothing to do with Vietnam, how it impacted his life. And this is about something about Vietnam. And he was a policeman, so he was in military police. And part of his role, so he was sort of a Secret Service type dude, and his role was to transfer money to the Vietnamese. I think it was a bit dicey. I think it was in exchange for cocaine, incidentally, or something like that. I don't know. He did tell me. The point was, he was supposed to meet someone in one of the major cities in Vietnam, a friend of his, a colleague, and they were going to do this exchange, and they had to meet with somebody else. and he was late. And when he arrived, he found his friend in this room and had been injected with battery acid, and was pleading with this person to kill him because he was in so much pain. It was his best mate, so he shot him. And he'd never talked to anybody, never told anybody else about this. This has been a secret for what would be then 30, 40 years, I guess. And we hugged, we cried together. And it was, to me, therapeutically, it's just one of the most beautiful moments you can have when someone shares a story with you that they've never shared with anyone else. And that night, he and his wife were at the verge of breakdown. The reason why they came along to this particular course was they wanted to recapture their relationship. They wanted something that would help to rejuvenate it, or otherwise it was over. And she'd planned that. She said, if nothing happens here, I'm leaving him. That's it. And so that night, he went back to his unit. They spoke for the first time in their relationship until the earliest hours of the morning. He told her about this story. They discussed the reasons why he behaved the way he did, why he was angry a lot of the time. And I met with him sometime afterwards, and his behaviour had significantly changed. It still wouldn't have been what I would class as the best, but it had changed because of that one moment. So my point is, when people have an opportunity to talk about their trauma with someone that actually cares, it makes a difference. So when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, and we're talking about qualities such as safety, as I said earlier, trustworthiness, choice, who it is that person chooses to work with, collaboration, who do they choose that they're going to work with that they think the client will trust, and empowerment. And the other word I'd like to add to that is non-judgmentalism. Not to judge a person based on their race, their colour, their service career, that they killed people, the fact that they have deep emotional hiding places inside them somewhere that just simply need to be uncovered is all that we need to do.
Very powerful.
Powerful. It's not so much a question. I suppose it is a question. It's very confronting, isn't it? What's your greatest fear? What's your saddest moment? That's very confronting, and I wonder. I just wonder in a group whether the group inhibits or helps the situation. I've been in group situations where almost a competition starts. Who's got the saddest story? Who's got the worst? Who had the worst childhood? And it becomes really people get aggressive and so on. So maybe there's a sort of an optimum size. You can have no more than half a dozen people, and it gets too confronting. Or maybe there's safety in numbers. There's speculation in my head about that context in which you can get that result.
You've run lots and lots of groups, Tony. Do you normally have that experience that people seem to be competing with each other? I've experienced that outside of groups.
We can have it with some men's groups where they collude with each other around domestic violence. I always put it into that when it happens because I just name it. What you're saying, I understand, Frank, and one would have expected that within somewhere like the Vietnam Vets group, because, you know, they're all about, you know, where they fought and, you know, who they fought, and, you know, there's all this macho shit going on. But the idea of the two questions, incidentally, was that the first one was designed to be non-threatening, but to allow at least the pathways in their minds to open up to fear. Now, at least it was like, it's kind of reminds me a bit like opening a door. So you just put that door ajar a little bit, and then the rest of it will just fling open, maybe, if you push hard enough. So the door doesn't remain closed, because you talked about something that is about an emotion, but it's non-threatening. And then you hit people with something that's really challenging, and they can't help. Well, this is my sense of it anyway. There's no research in any of this. It was simply my idea. But it then tends to open up the door to a whole host of other possibilities, because the door is no longer shut.
But there's also those questions you probably didn't ask in the first 5 minutes of setting up a group either. So you would have already established relationships and some sort of rapport.
Yeah, I do it in our anger program that I ran with Relationships Australia. I'd set it up in week 4. So we had built a relationship by then, and people were freely prepared to have a chat. Yeah, I don't do it in week 1. You know, this is who I am. This is what I do. I've got this thing I want to do with you. Yeah. No.
In terms of this competition that I've heard about before amongst people, you know, the saddest childhood, somebody said that even started writing a paper called I Had the Worst Childhood, because of this notion that they'd noticed amongst people of competing. Could that be part of a feeling of not being validated or recognised for their hurt?
Well, I'd want to know, why is it important to have something that is worse than somebody else's? Like, I don't even understand why that figures as a discussion point. And if I notice that competition happening in a group, I'll be questioning as to why it's happening at all. Is there a sense of satisfaction you get from knowing? It's like in a DV group, you know, you're going to get satisfaction knowing that you were the biggest bully in the house or the room, or that you were able to beat someone up to an inch of their life. Is that what's important to you? You know, like, you know, in DVs, it's about what damage you're doing to others, and whether you're empathetic towards how that impacts other people, women and children particularly. So I don't understand how anybody within any group would like to think that their behaviour not behaviour in this case, but their experiences are more important than somebody else's experiences. I think that's unhealthy for the group to start with, that there should be a competitiveness between experiences. Because
Tony, the groups that I'm thinking of were fairly new, and most people in the room didn't know each other very well. And I wonder whether it was just, you know, establishing yourself in the group. You know, I've had a worse story and so I'm important in this group, or you will accept me because of my terrible, terrible childhood. I've not seen it happen in groups that know each other very well.
So it's almost like staking their claim, if you like, on the group in some way. Yeah.
Yes, and also the size factor. I mean, the couple that I'm thinking of, the really bad sessions, had about 25 people, and the idea was to go around the circle and you each tell the story, and it was just too many people, I thought, and I just thought it, you know, if it was half a dozen or 10, that kind of thing might have been reduced.
Yeah, and that's an interesting group work technique too, because what I would do in a large group would be to ask anybody who has a story to tell. And so I'd choose, perhaps if there are 5 or 6 of them, that would be fine. And then I try and look for the person who looks least likely to want to tell their story. And I ask them to tell theirs. Because then you give the message to the group that it's fair for everybody, not just those people that have got the loudest voices, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Tony?
Sure, Priscilla.
Thank you. In my arrogant, uneducated way, but do you think that genes have anything to play with how we handle past trauma?
That's a really good
Trauma.
question. I was going to talk about that earlier, but I didn't know what was going on. So, intergenerational trauma. There is some evidence now, I believe. I can't bring it out and cite it for you right now, but there is some that will suggest that it does affect a person's chromosomes over a period of time, as does everything, really. I mean, our environment determines who we are, and our environment, if we live in it long enough, will change certain aspects of our chromosomes. So certainly that has been true. And they will argue, but I would argue, though, that at best it would be 10% at best, because we know that that applies to mental illness as well. So
I was
Yeah,
thinking more in the lines like, well, I would say that the three of you have come from good genes. And I'm talking about the parents and that, right? That's the genes I'm talking about, not from the damage from trauma.
International, all right.
So you think about like DNA?
DNA, that's probably a better way.
And so why would you say that the three of us come from good DNA? Because I can tell you, most people in my background wouldn't have said that my DNA was very good at all.
Oh, mine, Priscilla.
On the contrary.
Well, it's how I perceive you to be as people.
Okay.
But I would suggest that's because, well, I clearly come from good DNA then in that case. No, there are bad people out there that come from good families, though. And there are, what we will see good families, whatever that means, upright, outstanding families, but who are just terrible, terrible, terrible people. There are lots of people out there that come from good families who are psychopaths. So I don't think that the good family argument actually washes, Priscilla, at all.
So good genes has nothing to do with it?
No. No, because okay. I don't think good genes necessarily breed good behaviours. I don't think bad genes breeds bad behaviours either, quite frankly.
The argument is difficult for another reason, and that is, what can you do about it? I mean, you're born. You don't choose your parents.
Exactly.
No. Yeah.
So, so you discover that you've got bad genes. So what do you do next?
Well, you do, it's like having a gene. I reckon there's a gene that affects people.
No, I don't know that you know that you've got bad genes. If you have, so obviously I'm saying that I haven't got bad genes now too.
Yeah, well, I think it's like if you have a gene, for example, that will say that you're potentially an alcoholic. Well, if that's the case, don't drink.
Yeah.
Like if you've got a gene that says you've got a potential towards violence.
Or you can use it as
find ways to manage your anger.
Well, that's the type of genes I'm asking about. Yeah.
Okay, but you could also alternatively, Tony, use as an excuse, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Bad and often say, "Well, I just drink; it's just in my genes,"
Often you do,
People either go one way or the other, don't they? They either copy or they go the opposite.
They don't produce a genealogical report that says, this is my genes here. These genes are my bad genes, so I'm going to stick with them. And these are the good genes, but I don't want to be good, so I'm just going to choose to be these genes. No, it kind of doesn't work that way. Thanks. That's a good question, though, Priscilla.
But that is a really good question. It does go to that idea of intergenerational trauma. So are you saying that we can pass down trauma, but through our behaviour and responses rather than through our genes?
Yes. So what we experience in working with people, what I experience is that, a child that comes from a violent family, for example, potentially the grandparents were also violent, and there was violent trending throughout their whole family. So that person potentially comes to be violent because in their family, that was kind of the norm. This is how you deal with problems. I often discover that with men around domestic violence, they've experienced lots of violence. Their father was violent, father's father was, and they themselves have chosen to be violent. And the reason for that, the simplistic reason, there are other reasons, but the simplistic reason is that that is a behaviour they've learned to resolve conflict in their minds. So they haven't been shown much love, tenderness, nurturing, thoughtfulness, carefulness, and generosity. So they use this one way, one behaviour of attempting to get all those things that they're not getting, or they don't understand that they haven't got in the first place.
So have you ever met a man who was violent who didn't have violence in their background?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah, lots of them.
Oh, lots
Yeah, it
of them
doesn't
too.
follow.
It doesn't
No, it doesn't.
necessarily follow.
No,
Okay.
no. It
All
does.
right.
So it does follow where, so entitlement is an issue for lots of men. So there are other streams. So you don't have to have been from a violent family, but you could have been from a family in which you were indulged and you were given everything, and therefore your partner becomes your product that you own, and you can determine what it is they do or they don't do. So, and your children become the same sort of product because you're entitled to have everything that you want. And when you don't get what you want, you must reprimand the product by beating them up or controlling them in some way so you do get what you want. And a lot of men, a lot of people in DV relationships aren't necessarily the violent ones either. They find other ways to manipulate and control. So finances, for example, a lot of men grow up believing that men, for some particular reason, have some godlike quality that will be able to determine whether or not they can control money better than these poor lowly women who don't have experience in business, because they never become successful business people anyway. It's only us men that do that. Therefore, they should be the ones controlling the money because women are inept at that. And so I think there's a lot of, and so those messages come across that aren't necessarily overt in terms of the families that these people come from. They're very covert, but their messages there all the same. I mean, I for example, knew that my father was racially prejudiced. I can't remember an incident where he was, a specific incident, but I'm assuming there must have been things said about other people that made me aware that he was. And for some time, to my shame, I can remember occupying those same thoughts in my mind. So those messages that we give our kids when they're growing up, are extremely powerful because they're coming from elements of authority who they believe and they trust, and therefore they, like sponges, kids just take that stuff in. It's one of the reasons why we need to be very careful when we're talking to children about almost anything that will give them the wrong impression of how to treat others, and particularly to approach diversity. Because kids, some wonderful photographs of black kids playing with white kids, because kids don't know the difference. Colour is nothing to them. They don't recognise those differences. It's not until they hear their parents and other people talk about how terrible that person is because of their colour that their thought seems to start to change over time.
So it seems to me that lots of those influences are external when you're talking about those issues around men and masculinity. They're kind of cultural, dominant cultural issues. The same with racism, which was entirely acceptable when I was a kid, versus now where it still happens, but it's less acceptable. So it sounds like they play at that large level and then also infiltrate in the home.
Yeah, I think when those messages are reinforced at home,
right,
is the real problem. So they might be out there culturally. I don't think the issues around racism and stuff have necessarily diminished. It's a bit like saying the message around how to work with kids in care has changed. Well, it might have slightly, but it hasn't improved the system or made it better for children that are taken into care. So, I think we modify things over time, but ostensibly the same messages are provided. Kids don't matter. If you're a black kid, who cares? If you're Muslim, you need to not trust them. So, I think those messages are pretty strong.
But if you did it differently at home, then the kid turns out differently.
Yeah, if a parent confronts those views and talks about a different view, which is that, everybody is an individual and that everybody can determine their own pathway and there's no one set of person that's bad and one set of person that's good. If a parent can define that stuff for their kids as they're growing up, the kids will wind up with a better balance of the world. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. Kids stereotype people. We know that people stereotype people who live out where we live, because a lot of the people out this way are on benefits and are poor. So anybody that lives north of the city is poor. I had a friend of mine who said anything north of, what did you say, Dee? Anything north of
Grand Junction Road.
Grand Junction Cross. He said his shrub, as if people don't live out there. His family came from a wine growing background and were extremely wealthy. I can understand why you think that. Except everything north of Adelaide is also Barossa Valley. So did you get your assessment?
Yeah, so it's all very silly.
I think that's the same for down Noarlunga way and that though too, isn't it?
Yeah,
Once
north
you
and
get
south.
down south too.
Yeah, exactly. But I was thinking about what you said about, not much has changed and the importance of language. We started that conversation with the importance of language where people suddenly recognize something like a feeling of betrayal and how healing and how impactful that can be. And I was thinking often the language around child protection is euphemistic. So they talk about a placement breakdown rather than a child being rejected. And yet what is happening is that child is usually being rejected. So how can we make some changes there?
Well,
because that child surely is going to think that they've done something wrong.
Yeah, of course they do.
Oh, I guess even if they use the word rejection, they're still going to think there's something wrong with them.
And often children do behave badly because they're living in a bad situation. They're not listened to, they're not understood, they're not considered, they're not appreciated, so they're not talked to, and so they rebel, hoping that they'll get into a situation where they do have what it is that they're looking for. And unfortunately, a lot of kids go from placement to placement to placement because they never get what it is that they thought that they wanted. And no one, and this is one of the problems, this came out from a Create report, I think, that no one really sits down and talks to the kids and asks them what they want. And kids generally are pretty articulate about what they want, and they can be encouraged to talk about that in ways which is age sensitive and so forth. And they will only do that, though, with someone that they trust. Again, it's about dealing with trauma, because kids that are traumatised are not going to talk to somebody that's from the government, for example, particularly if you're First Nation child, you're not going to do that. And if your kid that's been placed in care and you don't like the care arrangements you've got, you're not going to do that either, because you just like to be shifted to another crappy care placement. So building those relationships is integral in terms of making sure that kids are heard and that what they want is provided. The problem we have, though, is that kids are really realistic about what it is they want. It's just that the government's not prepared to provide it.
Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, kids, certainly the primary example of that is kids that simply want to go home. And the government will say, well, the home that we removed you from 10 years ago is still the same place that it was 10 years ago, without doing any assessments. I've had lots of clients who have improved their well-being over time, and the government, for some bizarre reason, will not release those children back to the parent, because the social workers still hold on to whatever documentation was presented 10 years ago and believes that the parent is still the same that they were back then, without even doing an appropriate assessment of where the parent's at. Now, the parent may not be in the best situation that they can be, but it's probably somewhat better than where they were originally when the child was removed, e.g., no longer living with that violent, abusive man. So, and as a result of that, the kids don't get returned. I've got one particular case where the child keeps running away from her placement over and over again, goes to a mum, and then the mother has been told that she will be arrested if the child is found in her home. Now, what do? Do you bar your doors from a kid pounding on your door saying that you don't want this child in your house because you're fearful of being arrested? No, you allow the child in, and then you hope like hell that they don't follow through on the threat.
You ring up the advertiser and say, I'm being harassed by the bureaucrats. Would you like to come and take some photos when they're here?
Actually, it's not a bad idea, Frank.
Yeah,
Quite frankly.
that's good. Mm.
But yeah, there are plenty of kids who much younger than that are saying, I've had a child return to her father last Saturday, and that child, well, that was an interesting case because the child had been saying to the workers, the child is 8 and has been saying to the workers for ages, I want to go back and live with my dad. And the dad had done everything that he could. And I mean everything, heaps of courses. He was working, he had a really good job, is very articulate. The department would call him in every week to do a review. Now, I asked you, what in the hell do you expect to review after each week? Crazy shit. And they were really controlling. The social work was terrible. She's since has left. I hope it's because we raised a complaint. But they wouldn't let him go. They wouldn't let her go back to him. They were going to, in fact, go to court last Thursday to issue an extension on the order of 6 months. Like, you've already had 9 months in order to make that assessment. Why did you need another 6? And it was clear. And I said to him, it's not going to happen. And because they went to the Crown looked at everything that this guy had done and said, no, the judge will never give that order. And he got the kid back, regardless. So the department pushed back all the time against him. And eventually we knew it wasn't going to work. And there are lots of parents who are in similar situations where the kid's saying, I want to come back home, but the department's refusing to do that because, and this is another completely new topic, but risk aversion for the department is a top priority. So under no circumstances can you return a kid because the department's greatest fear may be realised, when in actual fact, it probably won't.
And yet I thought, silly me, that in the Nyland report, listening to children was a fairly fundamental recommendation in there.
It is. And in every report, I mean, the Create report also said the same. There was another report that came out not long ago that was specifically about working with kids. It said exactly the same.
Well, Commission to Child Sexual Abuse said exactly the same.
Yeah. Yep. So if all these reports are saying the same, what's wrong with the system whereby people aren't listening to what the kids are saying?
Mm-hmm.
Why would they not? So it's like, I'll tell you what it's like, folks. It's like being in a DV relationship where you're asking the woman, in most cases, the victim anyway, is saying, all I want you to do is to behave appropriately and treat me with respect. But the perpetrator keeps on saying, bugger you, and still going to keep beating you up. Because
So in this case, in South Australia, your example of the perpetrator is DCP.
Yeah.
And your analogy with that is that the parents are the victims in this DV relationship. And have you ever suggested that to them?
Yeah, I have. I have mentioned it to some workers that you're just perpetrating violence as so they're often, so when I'll bring that up is when a woman is being blamed for being in a DV relationship. And I'll say, when you talk about coercive control of the perpetrator, when you say to a client, that you can't see your kid for a week because of something that's happened, do you not think for a moment that that is applying a form of coercive control over the parent, letting them know that you're the one with the power and authority and that they have none? What's the difference between that and a DV relationship? There's no difference at all. But they do.
No.
I mean, there are lots of things that come to mind. I just don't know where to begin. I think of my own grandfather, who went to World War One at 18, gung ho, going to be a great adventure. He just got married. 3 weeks he was, and then off he goes overseas. And then Gallipoli was a total disaster. He was shot in the leg at Gallipoli, and then he went to the trenches in France, and he was buried alive by a trench that collapsed. And then he came home with metal scars. Obviously, he deserted when he was in London on leave. He couldn't face going back to the trenches. He was away 5 years. When he got home, he found that he had not only my mother, who he knew was coming because they were pregnant when they married. So he met her for the first time. And then, but he found that his wife had a new baby as well. No, you know, trauma is so complicated.
Here's that word. Here's that word.
Yeah.
It's only as complicated as we choose to make it, Frank.
And then, well, yes, but, you know, he was obviously in need of psychiatric help and didn't get it. They'd treat the shrapnel wounds on his back, and his leg was one leg shorter than the other. They could treat that, but they had no idea that he carried home that trauma, that is those fear of being labelled a coward, et cetera, et cetera. And then he succeeded in each child that was born saying, that's not my child. And each of the children born subsequently went into care in one form or another. Now, how to tease out what that means and how you would deal with it. You know, hats off to anyone who can give me a solution in that sort of situation. And then that trauma begins again. So two of my sisters, two of my mother's sisters were in the Ballarat Orphanage. It's the same orphanage I was in. You know, what's going on when you talk about intergenerational trauma?
I think we can often, I think, Frank, try and, you know, like we'll never get distinct answers simply because they're no longer here. But we can try and unpack, if we understand their history, as to what may have been happening for them emotionally and psychologically. And also culturally, you know, what was the culture at the time, and how did they manage that? You know, that shame he must have felt from coming back and being AWOL and stuff like that.
But it seems to me the least profitable line of explanation is the personalities. You know, saying it's their fault, or, you know, they should never have done that, and so on. It seems to me you've got to look systemically at that.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, Frank. Yeah, you do. Because those of us that work in the therapeutic field, I guess, can be the ones making a significant difference. And those of us that want to work in the political field too, I hope would make significant differences as well, because of where we come from. And I think it's, you know, and listening to people like, you know, Dee, you, Frank, and Priscilla, you're the ones that are there to inform our practice in terms of dealing with care leavers. You know, you're the ones with the information, not us therapists. You can tell us what your experiences were like, and we can work with that, with you, to unpack what that was like for you. But that's the best we can do. Yeah. But before that happens, though, you have to trust us. And I think systemically, in terms of organisations and government, that's one of the fundamental problems, is that social workers do not have the skills to start with, neither do psychologists, so it's not separating the two professions. That, you know, people who work in this profession do not have the skills to necessarily work with people that have experienced trauma, particularly in child protection areas.
Much food for thought.
It is.
Yeah.
So thanks everybody for being here, and those people that may tune in later on. I hope everybody gets something from this conversation.
Good.
Thank you very much, Tony.